It's such a pleasure to be here today. And as noted, I'm with Kingston Economic Development Corporation, and critical minerals and rare earth elements are one of the key parts of our strategic vision. And that is backed with companies such as Li-Cycle, Cyclic Material, Umicore, all calling Kingston home. And of course, that's backed by great talent with St. Lawrence College and Queen's University as well, that has Canada's largest mining department. But with that, critical minerals is something that's come up in every element of the conversations today. And if I was actually to reflect back, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, critical minerals, rare earth elements weren't part of my regular vocabulary. It's not something we talked about every day, but it is now. And as we're transitioning to the energy of the future, it's becoming such a key topic. And how are we addressing it? And this is one of the fundamental aspects of everything moving forward. So it's such a pleasure to be joined by industry experts here. And it is my pleasure to introduce the team here. They have all the wealth of knowledge. So Alice Jackson, the Senior Vice President, System Strategy, Chief Planning Officer with XCEL Energy. Ahmad Ghahreman, CEO, President, co-founder of Cyclic Materials, and Kiril Mugerman, President and CEO of Geomega Resources. So just join me in welcoming the panel. And so I'm going to start just with everyone doing a quick introduction of themselves and how they're connected with critical resources.
Absolutely. So greetings, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here in Toronto. I work for XCEL Energy. XCEL Energy is an investor-owned utility located in the United States. We have the pleasure of serving roughly 8 states, roughly 5 million customers between the electric and the natural gas businesses that we have. So if you look at the jurisdiction that we cover, it's the Upper Peninsula of Michigan into Wisconsin, over to Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Colorado, Texas, and New Mexico. So kind of that center swath of the U.S. there with lots of opportunities. Where we get connected with rare earth minerals is in the planning and the energy transition that we are going through. We were the first utility in the nation in the U.S. to announce moving to a zero carbon system by 2050. We did that back in 2018, and that was after already being the lead provider of wind energy to our customers in the U.S. for over a decade. So there's a lot of transition that's still left to be done. If you've been sitting in the panels earlier today, you've been hearing different utilities and different interests talking about this energy transition that we're going through. And so you know that it's not just my company. It's not just XCEL Energy that's facing this transition. And it's also not just about generation. We spoke a lot about nuclear and other resources, wind and solar and battery storage and the other conversations, but this is also about electrification. So as transportation electrifies, from like the EV panel that was just directly prior to this one, we have to rebuild our infrastructure from the distribution systems that serve your homes and businesses all the way up through the supply chain. And if XCEL Energy is not the only one doing that, all the utilities across the US, in Canada, and around the world are also doing that. There's significant competition for the materials that we're going to need in order to achieve that outcome. So that's why I'm sitting on the panel today, is a little bit of we have to make the plan in order to achieve the transition, but the availability of the minerals and then as well as the end of life of these assets and how they get recycled are core to how we can provide these services to our customers affordably and reliably.
Amazing. I will take it on the electrification and move here. Ahmad Ghahreman, CEO and President and co-founder of Cyclic Materials. Basically, the electrification of society, that is what we are planning for right now, is built on metals. We need metals and metals and metals and yet more metals for that. 2 sources to have those metals are either you mine them or you recycle them. There are no other ways to have those metals. Cyclic Materials is a company, it's a clean tech company, a startup based in Kingston, Ontario, on recycling of critical metals that we desperately need those for electrification of our society. We start with rare earth metals. Those are the core metals that we recycle, but of course, as part of that comes copper, aluminum, steel, and some other metals, cobalt, nickel, as part of the metals that we recycle within our portfolio of metals that we recycle. End-of-life products that we are interested to recycle are the ones that have those beautiful magnets in them. Those magnets, mostly called rare earth magnets, are the most powerful magnets that we have in our industry. Let me make an example. Anything and everything that you connect to a lithium-ion battery very likely uses an electric motor. think of your power tool in your garage. Those lithium-ion batteries are pretty expensive. So we put a lot of metals and critical metals into those. So if you do have those electric batteries, those lithium-ion batteries, then it just makes sense to connect them to most efficient electric motors that you can use most of that electricity. And there comes the magnet-containing motors, permanent magnet motors that are the most efficient kinds that exist out there, and we recycle those ones. Our focus is on motors, but motors also come with copper, aluminum, steel, so that would define our portfolio of metals. We are a startup born and raised in Kingston, Ontario. We are growing very fast. Very few years ago, we were only myself. Now we are around 20 plus 45, so I'm going to say around 65 people with full-time and contractors. We have 3 offices, Kingston, Toronto, and New York. We call Kingston home, very near to our heart. We have our operations based in Kingston as well. We are building 2 facilities in Kingston, and number 3, again in Kingston, is in the plannings for 2025 delivery. I will pause there.
Well, thank you very much. So Kiril Mugerman, President CEO of Geomega Resources. We are based in Montreal, Quebec. We started looking at critical metals around 10 years ago, 12 years ago, first from the mining point of view, and quickly we realized that the big challenge with critical and strategic metals is not necessarily where do we find them, but it's a question of how do you extract them, and how do you extract them in a way that's sustainable, it's not damaging to the environment, and of course it's economical. We know that a lot of those metals are hard to come by in the Western world. They are all coming from Asia, but we realized one of those reasons is because the processes have not evolved in a very long time. So Geomega focuses on developing new processing technologies, how to extract those metals in a new, more efficient and environmentally sustainable way. And we started doing that with magnets, as you just heard. So that's one material, but we are looking at doing that with many tailings. So mines have been in operation and they are extracting one particular metal, but something still remains, and that something is a lot, very large volumes of tailings. So the aluminum industry is something that has been an important industry for all of us. Everybody has a little bit of aluminum on them right now, and that industry produces huge volumes of tailings, of waste at the mines, at the refineries. And there are lots of rares, lots of critical metals to be extracted, and other not critical metals, but still metals that we need and depend on. So it's all about circularity. It's all about how do you reduce the amount of waste. It's all about zero waste. How do we move towards that? It's a very common theme, and Geomega is trying to develop those processes to be the future processes for the mines.
So before we really dive into some deep questions, I just want to zoom out for a minute. And what are critical minerals? Why are they important to the net zero? And are they really critical? Okay. So, Kiril, I'll pass it to you.
So the first list that came out around 2008, 2009 started naming a few metals. And then it was based on availability and how much of them are there in different mines, and the geopolitical risk. So rare earth elements is a very good example. Neodymium, praseodymium are very critical because, yes, we need them for magnets, for electrification, for motors, and we depend on, let's say, one country or very few countries. It's cobalt, it's nickel, it's copper. In Quebec, we call them critical and strategic, CSM, and I think a few other countries call them the same way. It's not only about them being critical, it's about them being as well strategic. How do you combine all this? And we can say that copper is very strategic and critical. Yes, we have huge mines, but there was a massive underinvestment in copper development. So mines are more, we have not found mines to replace what's out there today. So it's strategic, but rare earths, lithium, cobalt, nickel, the list is huge, and every country, every province has its own list, and it's all a function of what do we need for the future, what do we need to bring our greenhouse gases or overall our emissions towards zero.
Perfect, thank you. And what I'd like to look at next is kind of that, what is that geographic distribution of these critical minerals? Where are they located? What's the plan to extract them?
Maybe I can comment on that question. Maybe to add one more note about critical metals, just to add that the metals have become critical simply because we need more and more of those ones to go through the energy transition. For instance, just one example to unpack this is that in the past with ICE cars, internal combustion engine cars, we didn't use graphite, we didn't use cobalt, we didn't use much nickel. We did use a little bit nickel in the body of the car as the stainless steel. A lot of those metals we had no use for, rare earth elements. But now with the electrification, we are going towards the products that use more and more those metals. And simply put, we are not producing enough of those metals within the countries, within the jurisdictions to be self-sufficient to produce those products and be independent, basically. And that basically brings in the critical metals language, basically, that those metals that we're going to need more of those is going to become critical metals. Now, for instance, copper is there. Copper is all over the place. We mine copper in Canada. We mine copper in the US. We mine copper in Chile, in Peru, in Asia, in Europe even. We mine copper in Australia, in Africa. But still, we will need more and more of copper in the future. And when you rank the metals and the criticality, copper is not the most critical. Now, I expect everyone in this room to be a chemist, so understand their periodic table. Everybody understands it, right? So copper is a common metal, but still among the critical metals, simply because the amount of copper we will need for our electrification is going to be significant. But on the other side, so from distribution side, we have copper almost everywhere, but we need more and more of those to go through the electrification. But on the other angle, when it comes to rare earth elements, we sometimes struggle to find rare earth elements in every single jurisdiction that we would want to. So there is a little bit of localization of rare earth mines and deposits globally. But it's unfair to say 100% of earth elements coming from one country or China, simply because China mines around 60 to 70% of earth elements. But some countries have gone really advanced in processing of those material or metals as well. So what sometimes I mention is that those countries have become a vacuum for those metals simply because they import those metals, process their and produce the final product and sell it to the global market. And that adds a layer of geopolitical aspect to the criticality of those metals. And those are maybe a different category of critical metals to look into. And for instance, cobalt and rare earth metals would be an example of those metals.
If I could jump in on this conversation as well, when it comes down to, the conversation, I think you did a great job of laying out where the availability is or where these minerals are located. The problem that we see from the utility sector is that as we're moving forward through the transition and purchasing the products that are made from these metals, it's the movement of those metals to the right place in order to have manufacturing. It's the amount of mining. It's the sustainability of the mining. It's the extraction process that is going to be one of the critical path items. It's a limiter, quite frankly, on how fast we can move in the clean energy transition. So taking that into account when we're building out our plans, when we're setting expectations for our customers and our regulators, but then also understanding this, you can see this is not an area that we normally engage in. But because of the transition and our recognition of the demand that's going to be placed in this, we have to start taking it into account as we build out our plans and we move forward. The demand, not only from us, but from other competing industries, is going to rise, and we're already seeing it. We're behind in copper production today. When I look at my distribution system, which serves each of your homes and your businesses, we expect that we're going to have to rebuild that distribution system that we have constructed over the past 80 years. We're probably rebuilding the majority of it in the next 23. And that's because of the transition and the electrification, how customers are going to use energy and the amount of energy we have to move through those wires. And so because of that, the demand for these materials is going to increase. The alternative I have is to look for research and development that's happening that doesn't use these types of minerals anymore. So is there a different conductor material that can be purchased or can be developed that doesn't depend on these same rare earth elements or minerals that are going to be high in demand? So that's where it all comes full circle, is finding it, mining it, doing it sustainably can impact the energy transition tremendously. The timing of it, the pragmatism around what it is that we can do.
Absolutely. And, and it's fascinating to even think about what that demand will look like in the future, because as you say, you're one of many utility companies, but it's around the world. This is a global challenge. So I'm going to use this to loop back around to the whole circularity aspect of this. And how is the recycling going to help address this situation? And what is the timing to really bring this onto the mainstream?
Recycling is going to be a significant part of the metals that we produce in the future and consume in the future. How about I tell you that in future, the car you will buy, most of the metals for those cars will be already mined, and those will be recycled cars. So basically, that's the future we are going towards. Right at the moment, we are doing really good, but not superb in recycling of some of the metals. For instance, aluminum, steel, copper, a few other metals that are critical. We recycle them really well. When it comes to lithium, that we use a lot of those in batteries. When it comes to rare earth elements, we are doing really poor job. We are in single digits space. We are recycling very, very tiny little bit of the market at the moment. But as we go towards future, the idea is that with energy transition, eventually we will be at a point that we have already extracted so much metals and put into the different products that we will have to be able to recycle those products at the end of the life and put them back into the economy. And I'm going to give you some stats in there to understand why recycling is more beneficial than mining. For instance, in the process we have designed, we are consuming only 2% of the water that mining industry would require to produce 1 ton of rare earth metals. But we produce that same rare earth metals with just fraction of that water consumption. We do that while we produce far less carbon dioxide, less than 10% of the carbon dioxide. And we do that while we produce almost next to no solid waste. As Kiril mentioned, going towards zero waste is really one of the objectives of the industry. So when recycling industry gives you those opportunities versus the mining, so that helps you to understand that in future, we will have most of the metals on land, and we will still have needs for mining because we always increase our consumption by just increasing the population and all that. But eventually we will be at a point that instead of, say, 20% of the metals recycled today, average, we will be recycling more than hopefully 75%, maybe even more than that. Maybe we will do much better than that. Hopefully. I'm optimist in the heart, so.
And Kieran, I'd love to hear your perspective because I know you're also in the recycling space, but also you look at alternative methods of the technology to extract from tailings. So I'd love to hear about what you're doing.
So for us, recycling, we look at it kind of from different points of view. If we look at a traditional recycling company, and a lot of them are family businesses, and I had the chance to meet some of them, and they'll say, well, look, when my great-great-greatfather, he started this business in the late 1800s, and he shows me this picture, and the backyard of this facility was wood and some other materials, and that's what they would recycle. And then there is a picture from 20 years after that, and the materials in that yard change. Fast forward another 30, 40 years, totally different, much more space, different metals. Mm-hmm. And he says, well, we adapt to what's available in the market. If we look at it from that point of view, when we want to recycle today, whether it's magnets, or, well, let's look, we mentioned copper before, we mentioned aluminum. Those are being completely recycled today. There are processes, well-established facilities, collectors, everything is established. But then when we go towards those critical metals and strategic metals that we are talking about that will help reduce our waste production and greenhouse gases towards zero, well, it's all fairly new. It's all in the last 10 years. The recycling industry kicks in 10, 20, 30 years later. Why? Because in the beginning, it's all in small volumes. So all of you have tiny little magnets in your cell phones, but who is extracting them? It's very hard. Slowly, companies start developing equipment, how to disassemble it and get to those modules and get the concentration of the magnets. But then, you have the factories that are producing all this equipment. They have more waste, and that waste suddenly becomes more valuable. There's more material to be collected all in the same spot. And then on top of all of this, we have the mining industry. And the mining industry was always focused, okay, I've got this product, maybe I have one or two byproducts. Everything else goes into the waste. And tailings facilities globally are, well, it's a scar. It doesn't look nice, but it's been the norm. We produce the specific metal and everything else just goes on the side. And unfortunately, that was the norm. The industry was not pushing for better regulations. How do we make a mine with limited waste? And it just was not required. Today, there are ways of attacking it, and you have material that's fully crushed. It's all fine. It's waiting to be processed. You just have to tweak the chemistry. You have to really work on different innovative processes to get. If you look at all those tailings, there are some other critical metals that are required for our future uses, but they are in fairly small concentrations. But if you use different reagents, if you look at lower water consumption, reducing the carbon footprint of those mines, suddenly the economies start making more sense. And of course, we have the entire ESG movement, which is forcing companies to be zero waste, lower carbon footprint, and suddenly it makes sense for them. But 40 years ago, you talk to those companies, the mining companies or the manufacturing companies, they have waste. It wasn't important. But today, it's not only the need to go towards zero reduced carbon footprint, but it's as well the fact that our investors, the investment funds that are putting money into those companies, are forcing companies to make the change.
Absolutely. And to that point too, in Europe, they're mandating recycled content in a lot of the EV batteries. Do we expect that something similar to happen with North America?
I hope so. I really hope so. So this is on recycling side and on circularity side, maybe I'm going to say Europe is maybe a couple of steps ahead of North America. We shouldn't be shy of saying that, I think, out loud. They do have programs in battery material. It's in place already. So if you are manufacturing a fresh battery, a few % of the materials, critical materials in the battery for now, for the time being, have to be recycled materials that you are putting in there. And that applies pretty soon, hopefully, to the rare earth metals. It's not there yet, but they are, the proposal is under review in European Union. So if you're, for instance, making a brand new car, whatever brand in Europe, the magnets that you use in the traction motor of your electric vehicle, a portion of that has to be recycled material. That gives the industry an incentive to look into the recycling and take ownership in the recycling and consider that as part of their design as well. And that's a good thing. I think in US, in Canada, we are getting there with the things that are happening in the US with IRA and other bills. And in Canada, the similar things. I think at some point today, we're going to discuss that as well. So I won't deep dive into that just yet. But those are, I think, the pillars that are going to help bring this home in US and Canada as well, and basically help us to think of circularity as a necessity, that we drive towards it. The key ingredient in going there is innovation and technology, and I think we have a lot of capacity in North America to deliver on that.
And so, Alice, you were talking about the very real world example of, rebuilding. What does that demand look like? Certainly, I know from your perspective of your company, but are we going to be able to meet the demands?
Well, I certainly hope so, because I think we are currently working on the generational problem of our lifetime in figuring out how do we provide a zero carbon system from an electric and a net zero carbon system from a natural gas side. So when you think about, this transition that we're going through, many countries are looking at, dates that range anywhere from 2035 to 2050. And I don't think that the ones that have made announcements are going beyond 2050. It's like that's kind of the stop and the tail end of this transition. So we're looking at 23 years that we really have substantial work that has to happen, because those last couple of years are tweaks and tuning. And so that's why I don't necessarily include them in the full equation. And so when we start talking about the transition and the size of what it is that we are doing, it's daunting at times. But if you think about it, I can give an example immediately for Colorado. We just completed a transition that we're going through, and we had said we would achieve at least an 80% carbon reduction for our electric grid by 2030. That's not that far away. That's 7 years. And we just went through a resource acquisition, and we're over doubling the amount of renewables we're adding to the system there, as well as we are tripling the amount of battery storage that's being invested in. And the great news about that is we've been able to look at it and do the probabilistic analysis to go, the reliability is going to be maintained and affordability as well. We're going to be doing this for less than the rate of inflation in the US. And I'm not talking about the inflation we've been seeing most recently, around 2.3% compound annual growth rate in bills for customers over this time frame. And that's adding gigawatts. We're talking over 3,000 megawatts of wind, 2,000 megawatts of solar, 1,200 megawatts of battery storage to the system. But I think the piece of the puzzle that I'd love to connect back to the conversation here is actually what we were talking on a little bit of a sidebar before we came up here. And that is we're going through a lot of technological shifts in the technologies that we're investing on these systems. So even though I started investing in and building out wind farms 15 years ago, the materials that are in the wind farms 15 years ago versus the materials that are going to the wind farms today are different. So when you talk about that life cycle and the incentives, right, to be there, I think there's a lot of assistance that has to come forward today in order to stand up the infrastructure to do the recycling. Because right now there's not enough volume to justify the cost associated with doing that. But that will come. That will come over time. That was what we were all chatting about a little bit ahead of time, is as we get to consistency of the materials that are used in these various technologies, then it's easier to have the life cycle come in play. And we're going to need it, because we're not going to keep just having to extract a first time out and use it one time. That is not the way that this should be set up.
And on that point, so how important are the incentives? Like, I know IRA we were talking about earlier, and how that's pushing forward on this agenda, and to the point of how much capital do we need, and how is the IRA and how are incentives working to support this?
So I'll tell you this much. I was just talking about Colorado. This is one of the 8 states that my company has the pleasure to serve electric and natural gas customers. The investment over the next 5 years, roughly, in that state is $15 billion between the generation assets I was just mentioning and the transmission investment that's necessary in order to build it out. That's an incredible investment for the state. And it's going to take significant capital to make this transition go forward. The Inflation Reduction Act has enabled this economically for my customers, because the Inflation Reduction Act is going to provide approximately $10 billion of rate relief, bill relief for my customers over the lifetime of these assets. The majority of the assets that we are investing in on the generation side are 20 years. So 20 to 25 years is how long those assets are going to live. And my customers are going to receive $10 billion of benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act to do that. So does it accelerate it? Yes. It also changes what it is that makes up the provision of electric service. So we expected only to invest in roughly 600 megawatts of battery storage whenever we were looking at this before having the actual pricing and before the Inflation Reduction Act. That number doubled, more than doubled, with the actual investment that's happening, with the bids that we received, as well as the pricing and then the benefits of the Inflation Reduction Act. So these policies do have a place to help in the process. It's going to significantly increase the sourcing we have to go through for the lithium, the cobalt, and the other materials, as well. It's going to accelerate the need for the recycling on the tail end as we utilize these batteries, and then they come back up around for their end of life for our uses.
Absolutely.
And then from a Canadian perspective, how are the government policies? Are there incentives? How is that helping to accelerate the supply chain?
Oh, I can comment that Canadian government is trying to mirror some of the IRA aspects in Canada as well, which is really good to see those possibilities come into life. For instance, there's a conversation of 30% tax credits towards the capital cost that you would put for recycling or circularity related. Oh, did I lose my mic? Can you guys hear me? No?
Talk louder.
Okay, so okay, I'm back. So that tax credit that is in Canada basically is going to be really significantly helpful for the capital projects that you put in Canada towards clean tech. Let's face it, anything related to clean tech and circularity, excluding the software piece, are going to be capital intensive. We are actually building things, so those are expensive. So those tax credits are in Canada are going to be significant. On starting up the company, testing the innovative technologies, Canada and US collectively have a lot of opportunities to provide. But maybe one comment if I had for our homeland is maybe in the growth stage, there could be some more opportunities for helping of the companies to basically take off and grow from there. So that piece probably is something that we could do a bit better on that side.
So I'll comment on two things on Canadian and provincial side. First, from regulations, I think the regulations in Canada and everywhere will help with time to force recycling and accelerate it. And that's through incentives. Like if we look at our cathode ray tube televisions, the old sets, they all had mercury. Government set up programs to recycle those. Why? Because they wanted to help recycle that? No, because there was an environmental hazard, so that mercury is dangerous. So there was a program where the government was paying money to the recyclers to take care of it because it was dangerous. When we are looking at a magnet from a wind turbine, governments don't start saying, oh, okay, it's dangerous. We can't have a magnet go into the ground. No, crush that magnet, demagnetize it, and that's it. It's not harmful. It won't do anything bad to anybody. So the incentive from a government takes so much longer to develop. So then whenever those regulations do come in, because they start thinking, wait a second, that is a lot of waste. Can we do something useful with it? Well, it's coming out from another country. Well, let's keep the resource here. They did the dirty job. They did the mining. Let's keep it. Let's use what they shipped us here. So that's slowly starting to appear, and we see it a lot in US policies. We are seeing a lot in Canadian policies, European policies, and it's good that they're all talking. They're all trying to solve that problem together because they're all stuck without those resources. They're trying to figure out how can we use recycling to kick the percentage up from 1% to 10%, 20, 30%. And on top of that, it's the money. Quebec, we've seen, was a leader in Canada from 10, 20 years ago, putting money into natural resources. Then they understood and they started putting more money into refining and processing battery factories. And we are seeing that the government of Canada was a bit slower on that, I find, relative to Quebec. But right now, I think they're running at full speed. They're investing money. We are seeing all those announcements about the factories. I think right now it's very favorable. And all those companies, all those factories, they all have policies about zero waste. And the only way you get zero waste is when you work with recycling companies and with innovation, because without that, you cannot get to those targets.
And do you think that, are there any policy changes that you think need to happen in order to accelerate?
So for sure, so if we look at Europe, for example, a regular vehicle, whether it's electric vehicle, internal combustion engine, a vehicle that makes it to a scrapyard today in Europe has to be recycled 95 to 98%. There are different ways of calculating that percentage, but that's the regulation in Europe. In North America, we are at 82%, I believe. Those government regulations will help that. And a recycler always thinks, how does he make money? If it doesn't make money, why would he recycle it? Why would he crush it? Why would he process it? Yeah. So government regulations that will force doing that, force collection of materials, make it easier for us as a recycling company to get our hands on it and make the numbers work. So those government regulations, 100% will be useful.
I agree. I think increasing the percentage of the end-of-life products we recycle and mandating that is going to go a long way because, again, I'm going to rephrase myself here. When there is a need for something, innovation catches up with that and basically helps us to move to the next level. So same comment.
Okay. And I'm interested in, especially since we have people from different provinces and from the states, is there autonomy across this sector addressing the supply chain? Is Quebec working with Ontario? Is Canada working with the US? I'd love your perspectives on the autonomy provincially and both Canada and US.
Well, if they're not in a way that is beneficial to all of us, we absolutely should be opening the doors for those conversations and moving forward. I think we're still somewhat in the early stages for some of the things that we're talking about here, and there's opportunities. But I know both of you have activities in the U.S. We've been talking about, just between my company and each of yours, how do we stay better connected? What are the things that we're looking at? So I would say I feel like it's still a little bit in its infancy, but you all live it on a regular basis. So would you say the same thing?
I would agree with that. Yes. So we are probably still quite a bit of work to be done on that side and build relationships a bit more. It happens in our case that we work a bit more with the companies based in the US than for instance, Quebec, I'm going to say. But that's not because Quebec and Ontario are not interacting. It just doesn't happen in our industry that much because not many sources of magnets are available for us in Quebec, so that's been the drive. I'm confident if there was a bit better integration for the business between the two provinces, I'm confident there would have been better collaborations between the provinces. Would you agree on that, Kiril?
I'd say we see that the provinces between them, they talk. But they're always competing for a project. It's like, no, well, we want it here. Well, okay, if it's there, then you put the money. But what we do like is that the governments are talking between them. They're trying to make connections between companies from one province to another, from Canada to US. And they're there, they're very proactive. And they have their arms a little bit everywhere in every country. And we've been getting a lot of help from Quebec government, federal government in Canada, getting the right introductions to the companies who are trying to come into North America, but they need recycling as a solution, and that helps a lot. Certainly, it can be done differently and more proactively and more investment because innovation without government investments does not move very fast. So, but we are seeing a lot of collaboration between US, Canada, and different departments within the US government.
Okay, amazing. And with our last few minutes, what I'd love from each of you is what's the biggest challenge? What's the biggest opportunity? What's keeping you awake at night? Who wants to start?
I can start with that. We are excited about the future opportunity because we got into magnets recycling when it only existed in China. I think China started around 10 years ago. I was at a rare earth conference in 2016, and I was saying, well, we need to recycle magnets. And everybody said, like, what are you talking about? There's no rare earths to recycle. 3 years later, China published the first numbers about how much rare earths they recycle. And well, then suddenly everybody said, oh no, okay, so yeah, rare earth recycling does make sense. We are seeing that opportunity with everything. Right now, we are working with the aluminum industry. They have huge amount of waste from production of alumina, but that waste has rare earths and other metals, and they want to tap into that. And on top of that, they have investment funds pushing them. It's like, how do you get rid of that waste pile? And that waste pile is everywhere in every single country where aluminum is being produced. And you need solutions. Then on top of that, you go into another industry, let's say copper. Well, you have copper production and then that waste, or you produce zinc and you have more waste. So all those are opportunities, huge opportunities. And it's super exciting. And but you just can't attack every single problem. So we try and kind of focus within what we believe our technology offers as an interesting solution, whether it's less consumption of water, recycling of the water, recycling of the acids, reagents that we consume, used within the process, to help those companies achieve their environmental targets and at the same time make money out of it. So as long as we stay within that family of the same metals or same opportunities, we feel like we could make a change in the metals industry and help bring more sustainability to that supply.
Sure, I'll go next. You asked what keeps me up at night. My kids and also the lead time of equipment that we buy for the plants. If they could arrive a bit faster, that would have been nicer. So I'm super optimistic about future, super excited about future as well at the same time. I think circularity is going to be an important part of our future in globally, and this is the time in generations to look into this problem and solve this problem and help the environment. I will go back a few years to 2016, 17, when it was earlier years of another company that I was part of called Cycle on lithium-ion battery recycling space. At that time, the story we had and with the story we told people all the time was batteries are ending up in the landfill, and the story we have is 100% we want to be nicer to the environment. We want to be nicer to the environment. We want to be doing it right. Another company that I provided them technology, Jetty Resources, that's basically to reduce the carbon footprint of carbon by copper in mining by 50%. That's the same story as well. So this has been always a passion. With Cyclic Materials also, when we started recycling of magnets from end-of-life products, our story has been always we want to be nicer to the environment. We want to reduce the impact of what we do and produce the metals. Unfortunately, the war in Europe changed the language quite a bit. Now geopolitics have become significant part of the conversations we are having with upstream and downstream and governments and everybody that we talk to. Still, it makes it rare earth metals really quite important for the industry and the supply chain of a lot of businesses. But at the same time, I must add, environmental aspect of what we do is quite important. I usually tell people, I do this for my kids. Kids are 15-20% of our today's life, but they are 100% of our future. So that's why we do what we do.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And what I would say is that what generally keeps me up at night is concern about making the wrong decision. So I have the pleasure of leading a team inside of XCEL Energy that's responsible for the livelihoods of 5 million homes, their residences, the businesses, the ability for them to generate economic development opportunities, et cetera. That's a pretty heavy role to have. And this team is responsible for designing and then ultimately moving towards construction 100% of the infrastructure that is responsible for delivering the clean energy transition in a way that's going to maintain that livelihood in an economic way, and that's affordable for our customers. So it has to be reliable, which means in my cold weather climates, particularly, if it doesn't work well and we don't have the energy our customers need, or in those really hot summers, as we've been seeing as climate is changing around us, people's lives are at stake. So making sure we're making the right decision is incredibly important. The risks that I see to that come from a couple of areas. 2 of them, politics and preferences, and quite frankly, some lack of patience. When Tesla, Westinghouse, and Edison were looking at the electric opportunities that could come across the US and around the world and developing these technologies that I would posit is the #1 invention of mankind, the provision of electric service to customers, and doing it in a way that has high reliability, they were really cautious and learning a lot about the physics of the system. It has been such a wonderful provision of service in North America, particularly, that people no longer walk up to the door or walk up to the wall in the morning or at night and sit there and say, gosh, I hope this works when they go to flip their switch. That is a privilege we all get to have by living where we live and the investments in the technology that has happened by the utilities and other entities across our countries, which is a great opportunity to have. But we are moving into areas where we are playing with the physics of the system. And the politics and preferences of leaders don't matter when it comes to the laws of physics. The laws of physics will rule the day. Doesn't matter what you put on paper, the electrons are going to move how the electrons move. So when you sit back and you think about changing these systems, and they are systems, it's not just one piece, You have to be cautious at the same time as you are pragmatic, at the same time as you are looking for innovation and moving forward. So to me, what keeps me up at night is making that wrong decision that puts something that is so essential to my customers in peril, and doing it in a way that makes it cost more than what the family could afford. So those are pieces of the puzzle that we have to look at continuously. As we step into this future, we're transitioning incredibly fast. Like I mentioned before, we built the system that we have today over the past 80 plus years, and we're going to essentially rebuild it in the next 25 to 30. That's a pretty heavy undertaking on all of us, whether it's the mineral extraction or recycling that we need in order to be successful, the methodology we put in place in order for the physics of the system to continue to work, but also the gravity of the impact on every single one of us in this room and figuring out how that has to come together. I think that's something worthy of being up a little bit at night to think about.
Well, appreciate everyone here today, your expertise, and it's such a fascinating conversation from the extraction to the circularity to the real life examples of how does it impact each and every one of us on our day-to-day basis. So thank you so much. We appreciate your time.